The next presentation is entitled Scores, Camera, Action, Incentivizing Teachers in Remote Areas. And Dr. Arya Gadu will present. He is Associate Professor of Economics at the Sam M. Walton College of Business, University of Arkansas, Fayetteville. His research examines economic development topics related to human and social capital and urban economics in low middle-income countries, and he has worked extensively in Indonesia. Dr. Gadu, please go ahead.
Okay, thank you for the opportunity to present. This is a joint paper with Meno Pradhan, Jan Driebe, and there's Santi. Some of them are actually in this section. And what we do in this paper is we report this experiment that tries to address service delivery challenges in remote areas. So the general problem of trying to ensure quality public service is already difficult. Trying to make it better in remote areas is an even daunting task. And there are at least two reasons for this. One is that, look, remote areas are undesirable, and it's very hard to retain service providers in these remote areas. In addition, it's very difficult to monitor and enforce service standards in these remote areas. The typical government solution for the first problem is to give hardship allowances. You give extra money to try to bribe some of these service providers to stay in these hard, difficult areas, but evidence seems to suggest, at least for education, it doesn't seem to work. The second problem with monitoring and enforcing standards is that the typical government structure usually do a top-down monitoring, right? And the problem is that if you're in remote areas, doing the inspection can be very costly. And the second thing is the standards that you try to enforce often ignore local conditions that tends to be special in some of these remote areas. So our experiment tries to do is to do a policy experiment in education. We use an existing hardship allowance given by the government, and we basically attach to it some bottom-up monitoring, local standard, and establishment of local standard, and then combine this with some kind of mechanism to performance pay to allow communities to have a stronger power. And this is what our Kiat Guru experiment is. The motivation is, like I said, typically lower quality education in remote areas. And so what we did is we collaborate with Education Ministry, district governments to identify remote schools. These are schools that are at least an hour drive from disadvantaged district capital. And we work or we use the government paid remote area allowance known as teacher special allowance. And its value essentially equals to the base salary of the teachers. This TSA is received by permanent and government contracted teachers and also registered private school teachers. So our experiment has two core components. One is social accountability, and I'm going to explain what that is. And in addition to that, two treatment arms added two types of performance pay. So we did this experiment in 5 districts, five sort of like disadvantaged districts in Indonesia, in 1,270 primary schools. So the baseline was done in early 2017. Once the experiment ended, we did an end line in early 2018, but we get some funding, limited funding. What we did was we did a follow-up at 1 year after the experiment ended in early 2019 to see the effects, but only in 2 out of the 3 treatment arms that we implemented. So what are these treatment arms? So the first core component that I mentioned earlier is this idea of social accountability. So in this part of the intervention, we basically facilitate schools and communities to establish or to agree on a local standard that is going to be enforced to each other, right? And we call this a service agreement, and it's essentially assigned roles for teachers and parents on what they should be doing to improve learning. The service agreement can be revised at least once every semester, but the teacher component of it is then extracted and translated into a teacher-specific scorecard. Remember that this is teacher-specific, so each teacher would have a different scorecard, and it essentially looks like this. It has about 5 to 8 indicators. Each indicator is assigned weight that you can add up to, that adds up to 100. Within indicator, you have rubrics that explain what types of actions would follow into sort of like satisfying this indicator. One indicator that is a must across all treatment arms is a presence indicators, given that that's one of the problems that apply many of these remote areas. Schools, but communities can also choose things like teaching method related indicators as something that is less academic. Suppose that the community felt that schools should be teaching non-cognitive skills like discipline. Maybe they can ask the school to actually conduct activities that inculcate this non-cognitive skill. All of this is going to be basically evaluated and signed off by the user committee. So what is this user committee? So this user committee is a committee that is being set up exactly for this experiment. Its formation is facilitated through a consultative process between sort of like the communities and parents and teachers. It has a minimum of 9 members, and 3 of them are community leaders, and then you have parents from each grade of the primary school. They meet monthly to discuss the scorecard evaluations, and in the treatment arms that has performance pay, these user committees are the ones that are going to sign off the scores that will eventually determine the pay and pay cuts that TSA teachers are going to receive at the end of the month. So given this social accountability intervention, the social accountability intervention is applied in all treatment arms except the control. So control doesn't get it, all other treatment arms get it. In treatment, the first treatment arm, which is we call SAM, social accountability mechanism, that was the only intervention. We add this intervention, we add on top of this intervention a pay for performance mechanism that is purely based on presence and a tool to actually verify this presence, which is a tamper-proof camera. So indeed, this is what SAM plus CAM, the CAM of course stands for camera, is doing. In the SAM CAM, the user committee monitors all indicators, but the presence indicators will determine how much TSA is going to be cut depending on the teacher's performance. To provide evidence of presence, teachers take selfies at the start and end of the day, like the picture, and absences that is missing from these pictures are going to be verified by the user committee. So there are many types of absences, and this becomes sort of like a presence score. If the TSA teacher has presence score that is above 85, then he's going to get that percentage of their TSA score. So if he gets 86, then he gets 86% of the service allowance. But if the teacher gets less than 85, then the teacher basically loses all of the TSA. Obviously, this does not affect the non-TSA teachers, which did not get this allowance. So just to verify that there is no cheating on sort of the payment, basically we find that the payment rules are being followed quite strictly in this SAM-CAM treatment. The third treatment arm is SAM score. What we did in SAM score is we basically have the same social accountability mechanism, but now instead of the user committee evaluating only on the presence, they also evaluate on the non-presence indicators. In addition, we don't actually provide them with this tamper-proof camera as a tool to collect absence. So in SAM score, again, user committee monitors all indicators. As in all cases, this must always include presence, and the presence is being monitored by the user committee spot checks. But it also includes non-presence indicators that, as you can see earlier, can be something that is subjective, right? That is much more subjective than whether you are actually present in the school, and I can verify it objectively using the camera. So in this treatment, the performance pay is based on this compound indicator of presence and non-presence indicators, and they report a score out of 100. And the TSA that is going to be paid is equal to the score obtained. So 79, they will get the 79% TSA and so on and so forth. Again, non-TSA teachers are not financially affected. So design of the experiment, we actually stratify random assign schools into groups. The standard estimation, we do stratification effects, and we cluster at the school level for a bunch of individual outcomes, right? So here are some of the results. Remember that we have two sets of results. One set of results is at the end line, and it covers all of the treatments. But there is also the follow-up result that, because we have a little bit more money, but we couldn't actually cover all treatments. So the follow-up result is a year after the facilitators left. This is in 2019, and we only cover the SAM and SAM plus CAM treatments in our follow-up results. So let's start with our primary outcome of interest, which is student learning outcomes. So here, what I'm going to present to you is the mean of grade-adjusted standardized math and Indonesian scores. So we standardize the math score and Indonesian scores, and then basically just take averages of it. And this is the first year impact. What you can see is that we have an effect of between 0.08 and 0.17 standard deviations. And the largest impact comes from sample scan. When we look at the follow-up results that only covers the first two treatments, we see that the effects for SAM basically fade away, but the impact for sample scan actually persisted. So SAM-CAM yielded the strongest and most persistent impact on learning. When we look at impact heterogeneity, what we find is that these impacts tend to be stronger for lower grades, so 1, 2, 3. The impact is gender neutral. There is no boys and girls differences. It doesn't really depend on the years of exposure of the students for the teachers, for the TSA teachers. In terms of ability, the impact is stronger for better students, but it is more persistent in schools that were weaker at baseline, right? So that's the impact for students. We try to unpack the mechanisms by looking at teachers, parents, and whether school management changed. In terms of teachers, surprisingly, we did not find very strong effects. We find differential impacts on teacher, but not very persistent effects. So here,
sorry, Dr. Arya, 2 minutes, please.
Sure. Right. So here, what we have observed is the impact on presence and working. And we are going to split this by TSA and non-TSA in column 2 and 4. I think the easiest way is just to focus on that. And to make it easy for you to see, I'm just going to add up the total impacts for TSA receivers. And then you can see the column 2 and 4 above, sort of like the impacts on non-TSA recipients. What we find, surprisingly, is that in sample score, you actually find negative impacts amongst the non-TSA teachers in terms of their presence and whether they're observed working when they're in the office. But we also find positive impacts for the SA receivers in the SAM-CAM intervention. Unfortunately, the SAM-CAM impact does not actually persist into the second year, so it seems to fade away in the second year. Finally, we also look at whether parental investments in education change, and we measure this using a bunch of measures, but what we focus on here is the 3 measures of education expenditure, hours of accompanied learning, which is the number of hours children are accompanied by somebody when they're learning at home, and number of meetings with teachers. Overall, we find some positive impacts across all of these measures. Again, the stronger impacts come from SAM-CAM, and the impacts tend to persist along into the second year. Finally, we also want to see whether evaluation practices of teachers actually change because of these interventions. And what we do is we look at the number of, sort of like whether they do routine evaluation, the frequency of evaluation, and whether teachers are being observed while they're teaching. Briefly, the intervention basically increased all of them across all treatments. So even though you have differential impacts of the different treatments, what we seem to agree upon is that SAM-CAM produced the most consistent and persistent improvements. Combining social accountability mechanism with a camera is actually better. So I'm going to quickly just go through this issue of satisfactions. Basically, we worry that teacher may be dissatisfied because their performance, their TSA is getting cut based on performance. What we find is there is no really a reduction in, there is no increased dissatisfactions amongst teachers. we don't find evidence of widespread teacher dissatisfaction. And one possible hypothesis that we can discuss later is maybe it's because the interventions actually regularize the TSA that was previously irregularly received by a lot of this TSA. Okay, so to conclude, social accountability mechanism on its own has modest but not persistent learning effects. In terms of learning, SAM providing community empowerment using social accountability mechanism, combining it with a very narrow measure of performance using camera seems to work very well. If you want to think of a key policy takeaway, it seems that in our case, establishing a performance-based mechanism that is based on a narrow objective indicator seems to work better than something that's based on sort of like comprehensive subjective sets of indicators. And the final thing I want to show is that there seems to be the puzzle that why isn't sample score performing better? A lot of people assume that you have comprehensive, that should have performed better. One hypothesis that seems to be to hold up in the data and in qualitative analysis is that because it's comprehensive, there seems to be a greater room for negotiation, and that might actually increase conflicts between teachers and the user community. And indeed,
Dr. Arya, we need to rush up.
Last sentence. What we find as essentially is that there is a strong teacher pressure on the user community members to increase score in sample score. And if you have questions and you want to email me.
Thank you very much, Dr. Arya.